Starting a new job was always a bit daunting, but I was excited to dive into this fresh opportunity. The office was a bustling place, but with an unspoken order to it, each department functioning like parts of a well-oiled machine. I kept to myself mostly, trying to observe and learn. I wanted to make a good impression, so I spent the first few weeks familiarizing myself with the workflow, my coworkers, and of course, my new responsibilities. One of the first people to introduce himself was Brian. He was older, perhaps in his early 40s, and carried himself with a confidence that only comes from years in the field. He was polite, overly so, and seemed genuinely interested in my work, which was rare in this fast-paced environment. When he offered to show me around and help with some of my initial tasks, I was relieved. His guidance made the transition smoother, and I appreciated his insight. At first, his assistance felt like a blessing. Brian seemed to know everyone, and his tips about the company culture were helpful. But as the days went on, I noticed that he wasn't just giving me advice. He was always watching, always there, offering help that I hadn't asked for. It was flattering at first, but I chalked it up to his natural inclination to mentor. Little did I know that this initial kindness would soon take on an unsettling form. As I settled in, I noticed that Brian's helpfulness extended far beyond the office walls. He would suggest solutions to my problems before I'd even voice them. One morning, he came in with a coffee, handed it to me, and mentioned he'd noticed I liked a particular blend. It was a small gesture, one that I felt guilty for overthinking, but it struck me as overly attentive. Later, he began offering to take on tasks I hadn't yet completed, handling minor details for me as if he had anticipated what I'd need. He started with small favors, reminding me about deadlines, keeping me informed of changes in the project, and covering for me if I needed an extra minute at lunch. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate his support, but each time I tried to express gratitude, he would brush it off, claiming it was no trouble at all. Then he began offering to run personal errands, like dropping off my lunch order when I was too busy. It became uncomfortable when he showed up at my desk with items I hadn't requested, small tokens that I would politely accept. I found myself struggling to understand his motivations. I wanted to believe he was simply being thoughtful. Yet the frequency and intensity of his attentions started to weigh on me, a constant reminder that I was never really alone in my work. Over time, Brian's support felt less like help and more like interference. He began to comment on my work approach, suggesting changes that didn't seem necessary. Once I mentioned that I was planning to work late to finish a project. The next day, he was there, early, reviewing my work as though he had a vested interest in how I managed my time. He'd leave little notes or reminders on my desk, often detailing things I'd already planned to do, a subtle insistence that his way was best. It wasn't just work either. He started giving unsolicited advice on my daily schedule, suggesting changes in my commute to save time, recommending places he thought I'd like to visit. Each recommendation felt like a slight encroachment on my personal boundaries, as though he was examining my every move. When I started trying to distance myself, his demeanor shifted. The smiles became strained and he'd go silent, watching as I awkwardly excused myself from his orbit. My unease grew when he began appearing at my desk unannounced, critiquing tasks he had no connection to, almost as though he needed to assert some influence over my decisions. At first, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but his insistence began to feel like control. I was starting to wonder if I'd misjudged his intentions from the start. Brian's behavior soon went from mildly unsettling to openly intrusive. It began subtly, small comments and observations that showed he was watching me more closely than before. He started appearing in places I hadn't expected, lingering in the hallway as I grabbed coffee, or, coincidentally, showing up in the break room whenever I was there. He began messaging me outside of work hours, reminders about projects that didn't require immediate attention, under the guise of just being thorough. His emails, at first professional, soon began to include personal undertones, casual comments that hinted at an overly familiar interest. I tried to ignore them, but my attempts to maintain distance only seemed to make him more determined. He began intercepting tasks I hadn't asked him to handle, taking credit for solutions to problems that weren't his to solve. When I tried to gently refuse his help, he'd respond with subtle reprimands, a passive-aggressive reminder of how much he'd done for me. My movements felt tracked, almost as though he was keeping tabs on every step I took in the office. I began arriving earlier and staying later, hoping to avoid him, but he was always there, waiting, his gaze following me in a way that made my skin crawl. Any semblance of appreciation for his assistance had turned to dread. It was clear now, Brian's helpfulness was nothing more than a pretext, a mask for something darker, and I couldn't ignore the hold he seemed to have over my day-to-day life. Despite my best efforts to avoid him, Brian's presence only grew more pervasive. I tried to keep my routine tight, but he always found ways to intercept me, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mix of familiarity and expectation. My coworkers seemed oblivious to his attention, dismissing it as his way of being overly friendly. But I knew differently. His presence wasn't friendly. It was invasive. One day, I confided in a colleague, hoping for understanding, but they brushed it off with a laugh, mentioning that Brian just likes to help. Without any support from my peers, I grew more vigilant, keeping my head down and avoiding eye contact. But each time I dodged his gaze or cut a conversation short, his demeanor shifted. His eyes would narrow, his jaw tensing ever so slightly, as though my resistance only fueled his resolve. When he began appearing in places I frequented outside work, like the coffee shop down the street or the nearby grocery store, I knew this had gone beyond simple oversight. My heart raced each time I spotted him, feeling his gaze settle on me from a distance, a dark reminder that he wasn't just watching, he was following. My fear grew with every encounter, and each day at the office felt like a trap I couldn't escape. I knew I had to find a way out, yet the thought of confronting him felt dangerous, as though any wrong move would provoke something deeper and darker in him. Desperation finally pushed me to confront him. I couldn't live in this constant state of anxiety, feeling his presence lurking behind me at every turn. One afternoon, when he approached my desk with a familiar, overbearing smile, I took a deep breath and calmly explained that his help was no longer needed, that I could handle my work on my own. His face shifted, the smile dropping, replaced by a look of cold calculation. He took a step closer, his voice low as he insisted he was only trying to help, as though I was ungrateful for everything he had done. His words came fast and sharp, laced with an edge that hadn't been there before. I felt a chill run through me, realizing that he wasn't backing down. He was challenging me, asserting control over a situation I'd foolishly thought I could manage. The confrontation left me shaken, but it also made me realize how much power he'd taken from me. His parting words echoed in my mind, a veiled warning that this wasn't over. I knew now that avoiding him wouldn't work, and my attempts to establish boundaries had only provoked him further. The fear in me deepened, a realization that he was more invested in his influence over me than I'd ever anticipated. Left with no other option, I approached my supervisor the following morning. My voice trembled as I explained the extent of Brian's behavior, how he'd taken it upon himself to control aspects of my work and life that went beyond professionalism. My supervisor listened carefully, his expression growing concerned as I detailed the months of unsolicited help that had transformed into a suffocating obsession. Though I feared retaliation, my supervisor's reassurance provided a glimmer of relief. He promised to address the matter and take immediate action to separate us within the company. I left his office feeling a faint hope that perhaps I could finally regain control of my own life. But beneath that hope was an undercurrent of unease, a persistent worry about how Brian might react once he learned about my complaint. The remainder of the day passed in tense silence. I avoided Brian's usual haunts, staying clear of his line of sight as best I could. My supervisor had assured me that changes would take place soon, and the thought of being distanced from Brian was the only thing that kept me grounded. Yet each minute felt like a countdown, waiting for his presence to vanish from my daily routine. A week later, I was relocated to another department where Brian had no access to my new workspace. The relief washed over me slowly, a cautious sense of freedom that felt fragile yet precious. For the first time in months, I was able to breathe without looking over my shoulder, my movements no longer shadowed by his ever-present figure. Colleagues in my new department were friendly but distant, unaware of the ordeal that had unfolded just a few floors away. The commute home was my least favorite part of the day. After hours spent in the sterile hum of the office, the crowded bus or train was a claustrophobic end to an already long day. But there was little choice. I lived far enough away that public transportation was my only option. Each evening, I joined the flood of other tired faces making their way back home, each person sinking into their own space of detachment, eyes cast down, earbuds in, avoiding conversation. At first, the faces on the train or bus all blurred together, familiar strangers who melted into the background. Occasionally, one or two faces would stand out, a mother with her child, an elderly man nodding off, or a fellow commuter who seemed to share my schedule. One man, in particular, caught my eye more often than most. He was nondescript, the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about in a crowd. But he was always there, catching the same route as I did, getting off at the same stop. At first, I dismissed it. Many people had similar routines, after all, and it was probably just coincidence. Yet each time I saw him, a vague unease began to stir. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as the days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming more than just a familiar face in the crowd. The stranger became a fixture of my commute, his presence so consistent that I'd sometimes catch myself looking for him as I boarded. There was nothing menacing in his appearance, just an ordinary man, always dressed in neutral tones, his eyes unfocused, seemingly lost in thought. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but something about his presence unsettled me, a quiet, nagging discomfort I couldn't shake. At the same time, I started to notice another regular commuter, a man around my age who always seemed to be nearby, occasionally nodding in acknowledgement when our eyes met. He seemed kind, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth whenever he noticed me, a contrast to the stranger's vacant stare. I found myself relaxing slightly in his presence, an odd comfort in the sea of unknown faces. But my attention kept returning to the stranger. Each time I spotted him, he was watching, though never directly at me. His gaze was always unfocused, as though staring just past me or fixated on something that only he could see. I began to wonder if it really was a coincidence that we took the same route, if maybe he'd chosen to follow this path for a reason. The stranger's presence started to take on a more unsettling quality. He no longer simply appeared on the bus or train. He would hover near me on the platform, his movements deliberate, his eyes lingering on me for just a beat too long. Each time I felt his gaze, an uncomfortable sensation would creep up my spine. He seemed to know when I noticed him, turning away as if he hadn't been watching at all. But the feeling of his stare lingered. It was subtle at first, small shifts in his proximity, a pattern of movements that I tried to ignore. But the unease grew harder to shake, and I found myself changing positions, moving to different cars, anything to create a bit of distance. Yet he always seemed to find his way back into my line of sight, a quiet, relentless presence that now felt almost deliberate. The other man, the one who occasionally nodded in acknowledgement, seemed to notice as well. I caught him glancing in the stranger's direction more than once, his expression one of mild curiosity. But I kept to myself, too unsure of the situation to say anything. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was reading into things that weren't there. But the stranger's persistent gaze began to erode the comfortable routine of my commute, leaving me tense and hyper-aware with each passing stop. One evening, as the train slowed near my stop, I felt the stranger's presence closer than ever. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, only a few steps behind, his eyes fixed on me in that same unsettling way. The usual crowd on the platform provided little comfort, his gaze cutting through the mass of commuters as if no one else existed. My heart raced, but I kept my pace steady, hoping he would lose interest and fall back into the crowd. But as I made my way out of the station, I could still feel his presence trailing behind me. I picked up my pace, veering off the main path and taking a winding route through quieter streets, hoping to lose him in the maze of intersections. Yet, as I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, his silhouette moving in sync with mine, his steps matching my own. The once familiar commute had become a source of dread, each stop now charged with tension. I tried to tell myself that he'd stop eventually, that he couldn't possibly be following me. But the reality pressed in, an inescapable fear that shattered any sense of safety I'd once felt on my way home. And as I made my way down the darkened street, I knew I was not alone. The shadow of the stranger was right behind me, closing in. The cold air stung my face as I hurried down the quiet street, hoping the stranger would lose interest and turn back. My heart pounded as I tried to keep a calm pace, glancing over my shoulder, hoping to see an empty path. But he was still there, his steps growing louder, each footfall echoing in the night. I could feel his presence closing in, the weight of his gaze pressing against my back. My breath quickened, the edges of my vision beginning to blur with the creeping fear that I wouldn't be able to escape him. Then, in a single brutal moment, I felt his hand clamp down on my neck, his fingers digging into my skin as he yanked me backward. The force of it sent a shock through my body, my breath cutting off as his grip tightened. I thrashed, desperately trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron, unyielding. My vision dimmed and I felt myself weakening, my strength fading as the pressure on my throat grew unbearable. The world around me started to blur, and just as I felt myself slipping, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow broke through the dim light, rushing toward us, and within seconds, the grip on my neck loosened. I stumbled forward, gasping for air, and looked up to see the Good Samaritan, the man I'd noticed on my commute, pulling the stranger away from me. His presence, sudden and fierce, startled the stranger, who turned and fled into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had come. I stumbled back, my head spinning as I struggled to regain my breath. The Good Samaritan stood nearby, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and urgency. He helped steady me, his grip firm but gentle, a stark contrast to the stranger's assault. My chest heaved as I tried to compose myself, the reality of what had just happened sinking in with a cold, creeping dread. He led me to a nearby bench, giving me a moment to catch my breath. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm yet filled with a seriousness that hinted he understood more than I did about the situation. I managed a shaky nod, though my hands were still trembling and my thoughts raced, trying to process the ambush I had narrowly escaped. After a moment, he began to explain. "I've seen that man before," he said quietly, his gaze scanning the area as if expecting the stranger to reappear. "He's been acting strangely for weeks now, always watching, always lingering. I noticed him around you a few times and kept an eye out, just in case." His words sent a chill down my spine, the implication clear. This stranger had been following me, tracking my every move, with intentions that now seemed darker than I'd allowed myself to imagine. The Good Samaritan continued, his voice measured but tense. "I don't know who he is, but I've noticed his behavior on the train. He picks certain people and fixates on them. You're not the first person he's followed this way." The gravity of his words sank in. I listened as he described instances where he'd seen the stranger behave erratically, muttering to himself, staring intently at others, and sometimes lurking just out of sight. "He seems unwell," the Good Samaritan admitted, his voice low. "There's something off about him, something that doesn't feel right." His words confirmed my darkest suspicions that this wasn't just a coincidence, but a deliberate act, one that could have ended in something far worse if he hadn't intervened. The thought that the stranger had been tracking me, planning this, sent a cold wave of dread through me. The Good Samaritan's presence was a small comfort, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there were people who would step in to help. But the lingering fear of what might have happened stayed with me, each detail a reminder of how close I'd come to something unspeakable. After the chaos of dorm life, the idea of moving into a quiet, shared apartment was a welcome relief. I'd been looking forward to having my own space where I could study in peace and unwind after long days of classes. The apartment itself was modest but comfortable, located in a quieter part of town. I moved in with little fanfare, grateful to be away from the constant noise of dormitories and parties. My new roommate, whom I'll call Alex, was polite but distant when we first met. He kept to himself, and his manner was quiet, almost subdued. He didn't ask many questions or try to get to know me beyond a brief introduction. I assumed he was just the reserved type. Perfect, I thought. We'd live our separate lives, respecting each other's space. The first few days went by without any issues. Our schedules were different enough that we barely saw each other, exchanging only the occasional hello in passing. I told myself I'd made the right choice, confident this would be the calm living arrangement I'd been hoping for. Little did I know that Alex's quiet demeanor was merely a prelude to something much darker. It was the third night in the apartment when I first noticed something odd. I was woken by the faint sound of furniture scraping against the floor, followed by soft footsteps moving back and forth. At first, I thought maybe he was shifting things around, getting settled like I was. But as I listened, the noises continued in a steady rhythm, as though he were pacing, over and over. I glanced at my clock. It was well past midnight. Groggy and annoyed, I pulled the pillow over my head, trying to block out the sound. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I brushed it off, convincing myself he was probably just a night owl or had some late-night habits that wouldn't last. But the pattern repeated the following night. The soft creak of the floorboards, the dull thud of furniture shifting. It all started around the same time, and it felt deliberate, almost like a ritual. His pacing wasn't random. There was a strange rhythm to it, as though he were following a specific path over and over. I told myself it wasn't worth worrying about, but a sense of unease began to settle in, a quiet discomfort that only grew stronger each night. After nearly a week of broken sleep, I started to feel the effects. The nights became a blur of pacing footsteps, muffled whispers, and strange repetitive sounds coming from Alex's room and the hallway outside. Every time I drifted off, I'd be jolted awake by the sounds. A soft thud, a faint rustle, his low murmurs just audible through the walls. I tried earplugs, even played white noise on my phone, but nothing seemed to drown out his movements. I was running on fumes, my concentration slipping in class, and the few times I saw him in passing, he barely acknowledged me, his gaze distant and unfocused. It was as though he was somewhere else entirely, his attention absorbed by things I couldn't see or understand. My attempts to bring it up casually, rough night, or up late again, were met with silence or the barest nod. He didn't seem interested in explanations, and I wasn't sure I wanted to press further. But the longer the sleepless nights went on, the more I realized there was something unusual about Alex's behavior. He never seemed tired, despite being awake all night, his expression unchanging, his movements eerily calm and precise. I started to wonder if he ever slept at all. The discomfort I'd felt before grew into something closer to fear, a gnawing dread that settled into my bones as each night passed. One night, just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard a soft knock at my door. My eyes shot open, heart pounding as I lay there, frozen. It was him, Alex, standing outside my room in the dead of night. The knock was gentle, barely audible, but it was enough to snap me into full alertness. I lay there, holding my breath, listening as his low voice muttered something just beyond the door. The words were indistinct, slurred, as if he was speaking to himself or someone I couldn't see. I didn't respond. Instead, I stayed still, hoping he'd lose interest and go away. After a few tense moments, the sounds faded and his footsteps retreated down the hall. But I couldn't sleep after that. My pulse raced, my mind reeling with questions. Why had he come to my door? What had he been saying? The next day, I locked my bedroom door, hoping it would keep him at a distance. But his strange behaviors continued. I'd hear him pacing in the hallway, sometimes stopping outside my room as if waiting, his presence lingering just beyond the door. Once, I peeked out and saw him standing there, staring blankly at the wall, unmoving for what felt like an eternity. My heart hammered as I watched, my mind scrambling for an explanation, yet nothing could make sense of his behavior. Each night that passed, the dread deepened, and I began to realize that whatever was happening with Alex, it was far from normal. The lack of sleep and constant dread had worn me down. My classes were slipping, and I could barely focus, my mind clouded with exhaustion and anxiety. I knew I couldn't go on like this. One evening, after another sleepless night of listening to Alex's strange movements and whispers outside my door, I decided to confront him. I'd had enough. I caught him in the kitchen, his expression vacant, his eyes unfocused as he stirred a cup of tea. My voice was tense as I told him his nightly activity was disturbing me, that I needed my rest, and that, if things didn't improve, I'd have to consider moving out. He didn't respond immediately, just stared into his cup as though he hadn't heard me. Then, slowly, he looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I don't think you should leave," he said, his tone flat but insistent. "It's better if you stay. I need you here." His words were unsettling, but it was the look in his eyes that left me speechless, a strange desperation, almost pleading, like I was some kind of anchor he couldn't let go of. The conversation left me shaken. He didn't try to convince me to stay again, but his lingering stare, the way he stood just a little too close, all added to the unease. As I retreated to my room, his words echoed in my mind. It felt like he was holding on to something I couldn't understand, something I didn't want to get involved in. But whatever it was, I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. After that tense conversation, the disturbances only got worse. It was as if my attempt to set boundaries had triggered something in him. That night, the sounds started earlier, louder than usual. He moved furniture around in the living room, the scraping echoing through the walls. I heard him mumbling, his voice louder and more frantic, though I couldn't make out the words. The pacing became more erratic, a relentless back and forth that made it impossible for me to sleep. The knocking began again, but this time it was accompanied by whispers, his voice close to my door, repeating phrases I couldn't quite understand. Every instinct in me wanted to open the door, to tell him to stop, to force him back to whatever corner of the apartment he'd come from. But fear held me still, my heart pounding as I sat there in the dark, feeling the walls close in around me. As the hours dragged on, his presence outside my door grew more intense, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. It felt like he was just waiting for something, though I had no idea what it could be. The sun finally rose, casting pale light into my room, and with it came silence. I lay there, exhausted, feeling as if I'd been through a nightmare that refused to end. That morning, I decided it was time to leave, no matter what. I woke up later than usual, drained and groggy, my decision to leave solidified in my mind. But as I stepped out of my room, I was struck by an eerie silence. The apartment, which had become a place of dread and noise, was now unsettlingly quiet. I called out his name, but there was no response. My heart raced as I moved through the rooms, half expecting him to appear from a dark corner, his expression vacant and intense. But he was gone. His room was just as he'd left it, his belongings scattered as if he'd stepped out for a moment. The furniture he'd rearranged during the night sat at odd angles, an unsettling reminder of his constant activity. I checked the front door. It was locked, as if no one had left. Yet he had vanished without a trace, leaving no explanation or indication of where he might have gone. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling and contacted the landlord, explaining that my roommate was missing and I needed to know if he'd moved out. But the landlord knew nothing about it. There were no records of him having checked out, and no one had seen him leave. I was left standing in the empty apartment, my mind spinning with questions that I couldn't answer. In the days that followed, I made arrangements to move out. Dating apps had never really been my thing, but after a recent bout of loneliness, I decided to give it a try. The endless swiping felt odd, like flipping through a catalog of strangers, but eventually, I matched with someone who seemed genuine. His profile was filled with carefully chosen photos, attractive but not overly polished, a mix of outdoor shots and casual selfies. He seemed like someone I could trust, or at least someone who wouldn't make me regret agreeing to a date. We chatted for a few days, exchanging stories about our interests, favorite places, and ambitions. He was articulate, funny, and had an easy charm that put me at ease. When he suggested meeting for coffee at a cozy public cafe nearby, I agreed. I didn't expect to find the one, but at the very least, I hoped for a pleasant conversation with a kind stranger. The night before, I felt a mix of excitement and nerves. I hadn't been on a date in a while, and the anticipation made it hard to sleep. I spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear, eventually settling on something casual but flattering. I arrived at the cafe a little early, ordering a coffee and trying to calm the jitters that had crept up as I waited for him to arrive. The minutes ticked by, and my eyes kept darting to the door, scanning each person who entered. Eventually, someone walked in and started looking around as though searching for someone. I froze, my initial excitement fading into confusion, as I realized this man was far from what I'd expected. He looked nothing like the photos on his profile. Older, with lines around his eyes and an intensity in his expression that immediately set me on edge. I tried to mask my surprise as he approached and introduced himself by the name I'd been expecting. He extended a hand, his gaze sharp and assessing as though trying to gauge my reaction. I felt the polite words of greeting slip from my mouth, and as we sat down, I forced myself to dismiss my unease. I told myself that people sometimes use old photos or make minor exaggerations online. This wasn't ideal, but I'd promised myself to keep an open mind. Yet, there was something about him, his posture, the way he looked at me, that kept my nerves from settling. The discrepancy between his profile and reality left a bad taste in my mouth, but I tried to stay polite, hoping things would improve as we started talking. He began with the usual small talk, how my day was, what classes I was taking, but there was an intensity to his gaze that unsettled me, a focus that seemed out of place for a casual coffee date. As we spoke, he leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine, his voice low and smooth, but with a slight edge that was hard to place. Then, without warning, he began steering the conversation into more personal territory. He mentioned the neighborhood where I lived and even referenced a coffee shop I frequented, a place I'd never mentioned in our chats. I forced a smile, telling myself it was a lucky guess. But then he mentioned specific details about my family, details that weren't on my profile or in our messages, details I couldn't imagine he'd know. My discomfort grew as he casually brought up things that went far beyond what I'd disclosed. It was as though he'd been studying me for much longer than I'd known him. My mind raced, trying to rationalize his knowledge. Maybe I'd mentioned something in passing, something he'd picked up on without me realizing. But his precision was unnerving, each detail another reminder that something wasn't right. As our conversation continued, the red flags became impossible to ignore. He began referencing more personal routines, like the times I'd walk to a nearby park or the grocery store I preferred. I felt a chill settle over me, my heart pounding as he spoke, the realization dawning on me that this was no coincidence. I hadn't mentioned any of this, yet he seemed to know everything. His words became increasingly unsettling, his tone shifting from friendly to something darker, as though he were playing with me. He mentioned that he'd noticed certain habits of mine, routines he'd picked up on. My mind raced, piecing together the implications. He'd been watching me, maybe for far longer than I'd known, tracking my life from a distance. The casual smile I'd forced at the beginning of the date faded, replaced by a frozen expression that I struggled to keep neutral. His gaze grew more intense, his eyes locked on mine, as though trying to gauge my reaction, to see how much I'd figured out. My pulse quickened, and I knew I had to leave, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. Each sentence he spoke felt like a subtle trap, a way of holding me there. I needed to get out, but I had to be careful, to make my exit without him realizing that I'd caught on to his game. As he continued talking, each word drew me deeper into a sense of dread. He'd switched topics to places I'd visited recently, places he shouldn't have known about. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he must have been following me, maybe even for weeks. I tried to keep a straight face, but my hands shook slightly under the table, my heart beat a steady thrum in my ears. The more he talked, the clearer it became that he wasn't just an ordinary date who had looked up my profile. This went far beyond curiosity. I didn't know how he'd been watching me or for how long, but his casual, almost predatory tone left me no doubt about his obsession. I felt trapped, but I knew showing fear would only embolden him. I reached for my phone, pretending to check a message, my mind scrambling for an escape plan. I quickly opened my ride app, my fingers trembling as I set up a pickup. The notification that the taxi would arrive in 5 minutes gave me a glimmer of hope, but I still needed to act naturally until then. I placed my phone back on the table, forcing myself to make eye contact and nod along, all while trying to suppress the rising panic inside me. With the taxi on its way, I did my best to keep the conversation light, forcing myself to ask him questions to keep him talking. Each word felt forced, a mask of politeness I struggled to maintain. But beneath my calm facade, fear gripped me as he revealed even more personal details, bits of my life that I had never disclosed. He seemed to enjoy the effect his words were having on me, a slight smirk playing on his lips as he leaned in closer. My mind was a blur, every nerve in my body urging me to run, but I knew I had to wait just a few more minutes. The tension grew unbearable as he continued talking, describing places and routines I hadn't even realized I'd been watched at. The thought of him lurking in the shadows, tracking my movements, filled me with a dread that felt almost paralyzing. Through the window, I finally saw the taxi pull up outside the cafe. Relief flooded through me, though I kept my expression carefully neutral. I casually mentioned needing to take a quick call outside, forcing a smile as I stood up, willing my legs to stay steady. He nodded, his eyes still locked on me, as if savoring the last few seconds of his disturbing game. I made my way to the door, each step feeling like a monumental effort to maintain my composure. As soon as I stepped outside, I felt the cool air hit my face, a reminder that I was finally out of his reach. The moment the cafe door closed behind me, I broke into a run, my pulse pounding in my ears as I hurried toward the waiting taxi. I glanced back briefly and saw him standing at the window, watching me with an expression that sent a final jolt of fear through me. I slipped into the back seat, slamming the door and barely able to get the words out. "Please, just drive," I whispered, my voice shaking. The driver seemed to sense my urgency, pulling away from the curb without question. As we sped down the street, I felt a wave of relief mixed with lingering terror. I hadn't processed everything yet, the enormity of what had just happened, the fact that I'd been so close to someone who had been tracking me. I glanced back through the rear window, expecting to see him following, but he was gone. The cafe faded from view. As the city lights blurred past, I felt a mix of relief and fear, knowing I'd barely escaped from whatever plans he'd had in mind. As the taxi drove on, I slowly began to feel my heart rate return to normal, though the unease lingered. The driver glanced at me through the rearview mirror, his expression one of concern, but I barely registered it. My mind was still reeling, replaying the conversation, the hints he'd dropped, and the unsettling knowledge he'd revealed about my life. When I finally reached home, I took a deep breath, feeling the safety of my familiar surroundings. I went straight to bed. It was hard to get to sleep, but after hours, I managed. Since then, I've stayed away from dating apps, and I don't recommend them to anyone. Running was my escape, my time to disconnect from the day and clear my mind. I'd been running this same trail for months, its winding path through a small section of forest that eventually opened up into fields and hills. It was usually quiet out here, with only the sounds of birds or the occasional breeze rustling the leaves. The solitude was part of the appeal. I'd never been one for crowded gyms or noisy streets. This afternoon, everything felt normal. The familiar rhythm of my feet hitting the ground, the steady beat of my heart. It was comforting. The air was crisp, and the late afternoon light filtered through the trees in patches, casting long shadows along the path. I had my headphones in, though the volume was low enough that I could still hear the sounds around me. I felt calm, absorbed in the peaceful atmosphere, my mind wandering as I pushed myself along the trail. As I reached the far end of the trail, where it curved deeper into the woods before looping back toward the main path, I suddenly noticed something unusual. Movement, a group of men emerging from the tree line up ahead. This wasn't a trail people usually wandered off of, especially this far into the woods. I slowed, squinting to make out the figures, feeling the first prickles of unease settle into my chest. At first, I thought maybe it was a group of hikers, but something about them didn't fit. There were 4, maybe 5 men, and they weren't dressed like hikers or nature lovers. They looked rougher, their movements brisk and their expressions hard to read even from a distance. I instinctively stepped off the path, ducking down to stay out of sight behind a large bush. My heart was racing now, the calming rhythm of my run completely shattered. I watched them from my hiding spot, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of it. The men glanced around the trail, their faces alert, as though looking for something or someone. I was close enough to catch fragments of their low voices, though I couldn't make out the words. My mind raced with possibilities. Were they lost? Did they need help? Or were they waiting for someone? A sense of urgency took over, and I shrank further behind the bush, trying to keep myself completely hidden. Whatever their reason for being here, I didn't want to be seen. This part of the trail was isolated, and I didn't have a clear way back without crossing right in front of them. I just had to wait and hope they would leave. As I held my breath, one of them paused, looking around intently. "Did you hear that?" he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. My heart leapt to my throat, pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Another man shrugged, but his eyes narrowed as he looked toward where I was hiding. "Yeah, I thought I heard something too," he muttered, his voice dripping with suspicion. I could feel a cold sweat starting to form as they scanned the trail, their eyes searching the trees and underbrush. I shrank down as low as I could, pressing myself into the ground, trying to make myself invisible. My body was completely still, but inside, panic surged. I couldn't believe this was happening, that I'd gone from a peaceful run to hiding from strangers in the woods, praying they wouldn't find me. They took a few cautious steps toward my direction, their eyes sharp, scanning the bushes and shadows. I could see one of them craning his neck, trying to get a better look into the undergrowth. I felt trapped, helpless, my only option to remain absolutely still and silent, hoping they'd dismiss the noise as an animal or the wind. They kept searching, one of them moving dangerously close to my hiding spot. He stopped only a few feet away, his head swiveling slowly as he studied the trees around him. I was so close I could see the dirt on his boots, the tension in his posture. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat a reminder that if I made a single sound, they'd find me. I kept as still as I could, barely daring to breathe. Every second felt stretched, an unbearable tension hanging in the air. The man looked around one last time, then turned to the others. "Probably nothing," he said, but he sounded unsure. Finally, they drifted back to the trail, but they lingered there, talking quietly among themselves, their eyes still occasionally glancing toward the trees. I didn't move. I couldn't. I waited, staying hidden, my pulse refusing to settle, terrified they might decide to take another look. As I lay there, my body tense and every nerve on edge, I watched the men linger on the trail, still talking and occasionally glancing in my direction. I couldn't hear their words clearly, but the low, rough tones of their voices added to the dread building in my chest. I didn't dare move or make a sound. Every muscle was clenched, my body stiff from the awkward position I'd been holding. I wanted to shift, to stretch, but the fear kept me perfectly still. Time dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. I listened as they gradually grew quieter, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked back toward the forest. But even after they disappeared from view, I couldn't bring myself to move. I kept expecting them to return, to hear their footsteps approaching again, to see one of them emerge from the trees, maybe catching me off guard. The light began to fade as evening set in, the sounds of the forest growing louder around me. Crickets chirped, and the occasional rustle of leaves made me jump. I was on edge, hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. As darkness fell, the thought of staying hidden became unbearable. I knew I had to move eventually, but the fear of seeing them again made every second a battle to keep my composure. As night took over, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched across the trail, and the familiar path looked foreign, eerie in the dim light. I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. My body ached from crouching for so long, my muscles tight and sore. Still, the fear hadn't faded. If anything, the dark only heightened it, making every noise feel ominous, every flicker of movement a potential threat. I strained my ears, listening intently for any sign of the men. Nothing. Just the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a small animal darted through the underbrush. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. It was time to leave. I couldn't stay hidden here all night, as much as the idea of moving terrified me. I knew I had to gather my courage and get back on the trail. I slowly shifted, trying to ease the stiffness in my legs, my movements painfully cautious. The fear hadn't left, but the need to get home was stronger now. I took one final look around, making sure the area was clear, then slowly started to emerge from the bushes, praying I wouldn't run into anyone else. I stepped out onto the trail, my heart pounding as I scanned my surroundings. The path was dark and silent, each step feeling like a risk. I kept to the side of the trail, moving quietly, my eyes darting to every shadow, every darkened spot where something or someone could be hiding. The cool night air was sharp against my skin, and every rustle in the leaves sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I moved quickly but carefully, focusing on each step, trying to keep my breathing steady. The section of the trail near the forest felt endless, the path stretching out before me like a dark tunnel. My mind raced, imagining them stepping out from the shadows at any moment, blocking my escape. Finally, I reached the part of the trail that opened up into the fields. Relief surged through me, though I still kept my guard up. I moved even faster now, driven by the fear that had been building for hours. Each step brought me closer to home, each familiar landmark a reminder that I was nearly safe. When I finally reached my front door, I practically fell inside, shutting and locking the door behind me, my hands still shaking. The house was quiet, a welcome contrast to the suffocating silence of the forest. I leaned against the door, closing my eyes, letting the reality of being home sink in. I was safe. I'd always appreciated the quiet of my neighborhood, a place where everyone kept to themselves but was still friendly enough for the occasional wave. Life here was predictable and peaceful, a sanctuary from the busy world outside. One morning, I noticed a moving truck pull up next door, and a man, probably in his 40s, stepped out, his movements efficient as he unloaded boxes. He spotted me watching and offered a quick, eager wave. I returned it politely, thinking it was good to have someone moving in after the house had been vacant for so long. Later that day, I ran into him as I was leaving for errands. He introduced himself, mentioning he was looking forward to meeting his new neighbors. There was an intensity in his eyes, but he seemed pleasant enough, full of questions about the area. I answered a few, though something about his quick friendliness made me want to keep the conversation short. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just nerves from moving. Still, as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that his friendliness was a little too much. Over the next few days, I started noticing him more often than I'd expected. He seemed to appear out of nowhere whenever I was outside, even if it was just for a quick trip to the mailbox. Each time, he had some reason to talk. A piece of mail mistakenly delivered to him, a question about nearby stores, or an offer to help me with chores I hadn't asked for help with. Then, small items started appearing in my mailbox and yard. A packet of seeds, a used book, and once a piece of mail with no return address but an odd cryptic note inside that simply read, "Enjoy the little things." I tried to ignore it, assuming it was all just part of his eagerness to settle in and be friendly, but something about his presence began to weigh on me. Every time I saw him, I felt a little more uneasy, though I tried to brush it off as paranoia. But the frequency of these encounters made it impossible to ignore. I tried to subtly discourage his constant visits by keeping my responses short and focusing on my tasks whenever he showed up. But he didn't seem to take the hint. In fact, it seemed to do the opposite. His visits grew more frequent, and his gestures became even more personal. He left handwritten notes tucked in my mailbox, each one a strange mix of friendly sentiments and cryptic phrases, comments about things I had done that day, or mentions of things he knew I liked, though I'd never discussed them. One morning, I found a small trinket on my doorstep, a piece of polished stone with a note saying, "A little something for luck." My unease grew, and I felt a sense of intrusion that I couldn't explain away. I began noticing him standing in his yard, watching my house with that same intense gaze. It was subtle, but he was always there, just on the edge of my awareness, his presence impossible to ignore. Each day that passed, the notes and items continued to show up, each one more unsettling than the last. I felt my sense of privacy slipping away, replaced by the constant feeling of being watched. I knew I had to confront him, but I dreaded the interaction, worried that it would make things even worse. Eventually, I decided to speak with him, hoping that a polite request would establish some distance. I caught him as he was out front one morning, holding up one of the notes he'd left in my mailbox as I approached. I told him I appreciated his friendliness, but that I needed some space and would prefer if he could limit the notes and unexpected visits. I kept my tone polite but firm, hoping he'd understand. Instead, his face darkened, a strange look flashing across his eyes as he replied, "I'm just being friendly. You don't appreciate a good neighbor?" There was an edge in his voice, a barely concealed resentment that made my heart race. I felt my own expression falter as I took a step back, unsure of how to respond. From that day on, his behavior only intensified. The notes became more cryptic, and the items he left behind grew stranger. A sharpened stick, a small animal figurine, things that felt more like warnings than friendly gestures. At night, I'd catch glimpses of him in his yard, watching my house, as if waiting for me to notice. The unease turned to fear, each night a reminder of the invisible line he'd crossed, a line that left me feeling trapped in my own home. The following days were filled with a constant, creeping dread. I began finding items that were increasingly disturbing, tools left in the yard, seemingly harmless but sharpened to a deadly edge, and cryptic notes with phrases like, "Some things are meant to be close," or "You should be grateful." One morning I found a small pile of animal bones near my mailbox, arranged in a strange, almost ritualistic way. I tried to avoid him, changing my routines to avoid crossing paths, but it didn't help. His presence was constant, lurking just out of sight, and the items he left became impossible to ignore. I began feeling watched, even when I was alone in my home, his eyes an unseen weight pressing down on me. I kept my curtains drawn, hoping to reclaim some sense of privacy, but I knew he was still there, watching. Each night felt heavier than the last, my mind racing with possibilities. I didn't know how far he would go or what he was truly capable of, and the fear kept me from sleeping. I considered calling the police, but without clear evidence, I worried they wouldn't take me seriously. I felt trapped, waiting for his next move, hoping each night would be the last I'd have to endure his gifts. One night, unable to sleep, I checked my home security camera footage. My heart raced as I scrolled through hours of silent recordings, hoping to find something that could explain the unease gnawing at me. And then I saw him. Around midnight, he appeared on the footage, walking through my yard, his movements slow and deliberate. He carried something in his hand, something long and metallic that glinted in the dim light. I realized with a jolt that it was a knife. He moved closer to my windows, his face barely visible in the shadows, his expression disturbingly calm as he studied the walls, the doors, the places where I was most vulnerable. The sight of him so close, armed and focused, sent a surge of panic through me. This was no longer a case of an over-friendly neighbor. This was something darker, something dangerous. I didn't waste another second. My hands shaking, I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice barely steady as I explained the situation and urged them to come quickly. The police arrived within minutes, their lights flashing, breaking the tense quiet of the night. I watched from my window as they approached his house, speaking briefly with him before leading him out in handcuffs. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of relief. The weight of his presence lifted, and I allowed myself to believe that, finally, I could feel safe again. I explained everything to the officers, from the strange notes to the items left on my property, and the chilling footage of him prowling my yard with a knife. They assured me that he would be taken in for questioning, and that I had done the right thing by reporting him. I thanked them, feeling a rush of gratitude as they left. I could barely believe it was over, the nightmare finally coming to an end. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, the silence of the night no longer tainted by the fear that he was lurking just outside. A few days later, however, I received news that shattered my fragile sense of peace. The neighbor had been released, the charges apparently insufficient to hold him. I felt a wave of disbelief and fear. After everything, he was free to return, to move around as he pleased. But when I walked outside that morning, I saw that his house was empty. The front door was closed, his windows dark, and a for sale sign stood in the yard. He had moved out. I felt a strange mix of relief and unease, but now he was gone.